Alright, so this is part 2 of the Platonic dialogue, Crito. In the first part, we have this discussion between Socrates and Crito about his situation. He has recently been convicted to die for corrupting the city youth, not believing in the city gods, believing in his own gods. And Crito, his friend, has been trying to convince him that what he is doing is betraying his friends, his family, and most importantly, betraying the persona of this person that has devoted their life to virtue and to truth and to wisdom. And Socrates disagrees with this. He says that he must accept the determination of the state. And where we left off picks up at this point of his reasoning why the state should be, why it is better to accept the punishment that is handed down by the state rather than to escape and to undermine the laws of the city. So we begin. Socrates says, "Then what if the laws said, was that the agreement between us, Socrates? Or was it to respect the judgments that the city came to? And if we wondered at their words, they would perhaps add, Socrates, do not wonder at what we say, but answer, since you are accustomed to proceed by question and answer. Come now, what accusation do you bring against us in the city? That you should try and destroy us? Did we not first bring you to birth? And was it not through us that your father married your mother and begat you? Tell you, do you find anything to criticize in those of us who are concerned with marriage? And I would say that I do not criticize them." Socrates speaking. The state continuing, or in those of us concerned with the nature of babies and the education that you two received, were those assigned to that subject not right to instruct your father, to educate you in the arts and in the physical culture? And I would say that they were right. Very well, they would continue. And after you were born and nurtured and educated, could you, in the first place, deny that you are our offspring and servant, both you and your forefathers? If that is so, do you think that we are on an equal footing as regards the right, and that whatever we do to you, it is right for you to do to us? You are not on an equal footing with your father as regards the right, nor with your master, if you had one, so as to retaliate for anything they did to you, to revile them if they reviled you, to beat them if they beat you, and so with many other things. Do you think you have this right to retaliation against your country and its laws? That if we undertake to destroy you and think it right to do so, you can undertake to destroy us as far as you can in return? And will you say that you are right to do so? You who truly care for virtue. Is your wisdom such as not to realize that your country is to be honored more than your mother, your father, and all your ancestors? That it is more to be revered and more sacred, and that it counts for more among the gods and sensible men, that you must worship it, yield to it, and placate its anger more than your fathers? You must either persuade it or obey its orders, and endure in silence whatever it instructs you to endure whether blows or bonds, and if it leads you into war, to be wounded or killed, he must obey. To do so is right, and one must not give way or retreat or leave one's post, but both in war and in courts and everywhere else, one must obey the commands of one's city and country, or persuade it as to the nature of justice. It is impious to bring violence to bear against your mother and or father. It is much more so to use it against your country. What shall we say in reply, Crito, that the laws speak the truth or not? And Crito says, I think they do. So what can be said of this opinion? The way that Socrates reflects on his duty to his city and to his country. We have to remember from the last episode when Socrates says, see what follows from this. If we leave here without the city's permission, are we harming people whom we should least do harm to? Are we sticking to just agreement or not? Look at it this way. If, as we were planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, the laws and the state came and confronted us and asked, tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not by this action you are intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city, as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force, but are nullified and set at naught by private individuals? Now Socrates says, what shall we answer to this and other such arguments? For many things could be said, especially by an orator, on behalf of this law we are destroying, which orders that the judgments of the courts shall be carried out. Shall we say in answer, the city wronged me, and its decision was not right? Shall we say that or what? And Crito says, yes, by Zeus, Socrates, that is our answer. And we spent some time last episode talking about what this city is, what exactly it means for us. I'm not sure what kind of conclusion that we came to, but it was something more substantial than just an economic relationship. People that live in a collective, that live in groups, that are in families, are indeed bound by something. Now what they are bound by, their bonds can be any degree of strength. And I think what constitutes their strength depends in no small part on their virtue. It depends on the value that they place in the interaction with one another. A relationship that is founded upon genuine love is a stronger relationship than one bound by a contract, let's say, or as I mentioned earlier, an economic relationship. At least most of us would like to think so. And of course there are outliers to this scenario. But the image that we are painted here is a scenario in which we betray the laws of the city. Now, what are the consequences of man betraying the laws of the city. Now perhaps we can make the argument that if one man is to flee into exile and not to bear the punishment that the state has inflicted upon him, that the law would not really suffer markedly from this experience, for there are many people within the boundaries and the sort of surface area of the collective in question. And as long as the law applies to the majority, it applies to most of us. And it's generally good at maintaining order, then no harm, no foul. For in the case of Socrates and his interlocutor, Crito, who wishes to ferry him away to another land, under the cover of darkness perhaps, certainly in secrecy. This seemingly would be against the state's wishes. Perhaps they would bribe state officials, who knows, but Socrates seems to have this conception, this opinion. He holds fast to his commitment to the state. And this conversation that he has had between the state, or the city of Athens, and himself is quite an interesting one. I think it gives us an insight into the responsibilities of the state, but also the responsibilities of the individual, as it is perceived by a man that lives a life of righteousness. I guess we can make the additional comment that this insight that it gives us is specific to the time in which we are reading this dialogue. This happened over 2,000 years ago. The conceptions of the relationship of man to state, I think, perhaps has changed a bit in our modern day. It has fluctuated through the ages. And there's no doubt in my mind that it will continue to fluctuate. We will always be dealing with similar patterns and similar perennial patterns. We will be burdened by familiar things. They will come to us in different forms, but their nature will be all the same. But for our part now, I think it's useful to examine the relationship of this man and this state, and what he believes is right, given the time that he finds himself in, and what could be said of his behavior and his beliefs to man today. What can we learn from it? And so the first thing that comes to mind is the various obligations that the state seems to be responsible for. The second thing that comes to mind is the idea that the action of Socrates, by not accepting the punishment of the state, will do some irreparable harm to the state. And so both of these things I would like to explore. In the matter of the first, I'll give the responsibilities that are noted here by Socrates, responsibilities of the state. But then I would like to dive sort of into that so we understand the relationship between state and individual, but also then to understand what it means for the particular accusation on the part of Socrates via Crito, what it means in the context of this relationship. So the first, did we not bring you to birth? Was it not through us that your father married your mother and begat you? Now, sort of from the context of what I'm reading here, it could mean a few different things. It could mean that the state arranged the marriage between his father and his mother. Or it could mean that by the state decree, his father and mother were perhaps married privately, but were required to produce an offspring or a certain number of offspring. Now, this is a thought that did cross my mind, as I mentioned about the context and the age that we find ourselves in. And after coming off of the Psalms, I have this acute feeling, idea, conception of how fragile the ancient peoples must have been and their societies. Now, this is a double-edged sword. On one hand, I think there have been very strong ancient societies. But on the other hand, in the absence of certain modern marvels, like medicine, like structural engineering, and massive material prosperity and abundance of food, you can imagine small cities, city-states, their attention towards their population, democratic or not, must have been considerable. They must have been always concerned about the dangers of what lies beyond the collective. They were much closer to that state of destitution. They were much more aware of the barbarous state, not only in the physical sense, but also the mental sense. And from this, I think we can add another fact here, a fact from the internet. So this may or may not be correct, but I do have reason to believe that this is a reliable source. That in Athens, citizens were required to produce a certain number of children in order to maintain their status as citizens and to participate in the political life of the city. Because the survival of the city-state depended on a stable and growing population. Now again, this directly relates, I think, to the immediate nature of their societies. Now, they're primitive in one sense, in a sense that it would take less force, it would take less inertia to move them off of the step back onto the base level. This base level is subsistence living, hunter and gatherer living. Whereas in our modern day society, in terms of physical and material prosperity, we are a few steps above the ancient peoples. Now, I'm not sure I would make the same argument spiritually, but I would certainly make the argument scientifically. And I think as a result of this, the modern day peoples are much more removed from the possibility of that state of being occurring. Now, it's certainly possible that it can. In our future, as I see it in 2023, we do risk some catastrophic population declines coming up here. We risk changing power dynamics and the rising possibility of a major war between major powers increases when these things happen. Our globalized, interconnected world, I think, will change a bit. We also have massive innovations on the horizon with artificial intelligence. So this age that we find ourselves in is quite interesting. the questions that we ask ourselves about the relationship between man and the state, I think, remains quite constant. But the point being, the modern man is about to, and is, going through a very turbulent period, quite a destabilizing period mentally. But the responsibility of the ancient state, that is, more specifically the state of, and the city of Athens, we see the argument put forth that the state seems to accept responsibility for the birth of Socrates. And perhaps the marriage. Perhaps there were officials that were concerned about Athenians finding each other, marrying each other, and having children to support the population. And perhaps there was a little government office somewhere, sort of the government matchmakers, if you will. Who knows? What we do know is that Socrates uses this example to support his devotion to the state of Athens. I should say, perhaps more clearly, that he's using this argument to combat Crito's argument, or to combat the statement that he made. The city wronged me, and his decision was not right. And so thereby, understanding that their decision is not right, then if a man is committed to doing what is good and what is right, then they should disobey the laws of the state. Now this is the counter-argument to that. That because of this and that, because of this relationship that I have to the state, therefore I must commit myself to its laws, and the first of which, again, is this birth. Perhaps it was state-sanctioned. Next we have the concern of the state. So we have two things. Or in those of us concerned with the nature of babies and the education that you two received, were those assigned to that subject not right to instruct your father to educate you in the arts and in physical culture? And so here we have, at least in this case of Socrates, pretty intricate government involvement with education. Were those assigned to that subject not right to instruct your father to educate you in the arts and in physical culture, as if there was a political, an arm of this state that reached so far into the life of this person, Socrates, that they instructed his father as to how his education should go and what it should be. Now, I'm not making a judgment here. Of course, our society, I was educated in a public school for high school, so that's not entirely out of the realm of what we consider to be acceptable in our modern day. But certainly the state did not approach my father for what he can and cannot do, or they didn't educate him in particular about what he could teach me and what he couldn't teach me. This would certainly be an interesting dynamic if the parents were that involved in their education. Sort of everybody was homeschooled, but I'm not exactly sure how the Athenian state ran their education. All I know is from what I read here, and it does seem that there, at the very least, there was some influence or some relationship between the state and Socrates' father, and that impacted his education, the direction in which his education went. And to this he says, I would say that they were right, they being the state. And the state continues, and after you were born and nurtured and educated, could you in the first place deny that you are our offspring and servant, both you and your forefathers? If that is so, do you think that we are on an equal footing as regards the right, and that whatever we do to you, it is right for you to do to us? Now, this is an interesting philosophical question, because this is the argument, well, there would be no you if there was no us. We, in a sense, played a role in creating you. And so therefore you have a certain responsibility to us, to maintain us, let's say, because we facilitated you. Keep in mind, we're not talking simply about paying taxes or about voting for a particular, or doing our part civically, participating in jury service or voting in an election or something like this. We're talking about a man that is convicted of a crime and about to be put to death. And by this reasoning, by this logic, it seems as though the state is trying to make the argument that because of these things, that you should obey us and submit and go to your death. Which again is counter to, I would say potentially counter to what Socrates lives by. And I think this is exactly why Crito is bringing this, or at least agreeing with the statement that the city wronged me and its decision was not right. And perhaps Socrates is making a statement here that two rights don't make a wrong. And he did make his stand, saying that it is wrong to convict me, wrong to put me to death. But this submission by Socrates is a difficult thing to swallow. It's a difficult pill to swallow. It seems that Americans are educated, and at least some of us still believe that if our government steps out of line, that it's our responsibility to put it back into line, regardless of its role in facilitating our existence and our birth. We have a responsibility to the future generations to keep this thing going in a way that is protective of the rights of man. And I would like to pause for a moment and recognize that the Athenian state did play a significant role in the education of the young. It's not entirely different to that of the argument for state involvement for population growth. You know, a growing and steadily growing population is good for the security of the state. A well-educated citizenry was also essential to the stability and the prosperity of the state. And from what I'm reading online, it seems as though the education of the young in Athens was a primary responsibility of the father or other male relatives. And the state was the one that provided the resources for that to take place. And it also seems here from the text that the state also probably had officials to guide the parents or the fathers in educating the boys. But let's return to what we were talking about before. After you were born and nurtured and educated, could you in the first place deny that you are our offspring, that we are on an equal footing as regards the right, and that whatever we do to you, it is right for you to do to us? You were not on an equal footing with your father as regards the right, nor with your master, if you had one, so as to retaliate for anything they did to you, to revile them if they reviled you, to beat them if they beat you, and so with many other things. Do you think you have this right to retaliate against your country and its laws? And that is the question. And so we have this proposal by the state that just like the relationship that you have to your father, perhaps when you were young, you do not have similar rights. I would say that you are not on equal footing in terms of right and wrong. The father has certain privileges over the son as a parent. But here, it's a confounding relationship, because in the modern day we have this separation of church and state. The involvement to such a degree by the state in this question is a bit unsettling for me. Now, I think it is true that when we are young, that in terms of the rights of the child, they're severely diminished within a strong household, and they necessarily have to be. The child has to be under an authoritarian relationship, albeit backed by love, but still this relationship keeps them in line. It gives them guardrails to bump up against so that they can be molded just as perhaps a bonsai tree grows over the years. It's continually pruned and shaped to be the shape that we want it. And so is the raising of our offspring. We continually prune them. We give them structural barriers for which they can move within. Perhaps we open them up a little bit here and there and allow them to make mistakes, but all the while securing them, making sure that they don't mess up too bad, screw up their life for good in the long run. And this is all well and good for my conscience to handle. But it seems as though the state here does argue for something a bit greater, and a relationship that is a bit more intruding. And the thing here is about if the state beats you, if your father beats you, that does not give you the right for you to do the same back to your father, the state, or your master. Does not give you the right to revile them if they've done something to you. You cannot sort of throw it back at them in return. Now, this is not, I would contend, necessarily an authoritarian relationship because of some of the words that we find later on in this passage. But it is a bit of an uncomfortable conversation. Do you think you have the right to retaliate against your country and its laws? Now, of course, the argument that we are trying to debate here is that, well, if the laws are unjust, then we have the right to do so. And certainly that is part of the ethos in this country. Now, there's a fine line to be drawn there. Because these questions of justice and piousness and all of this, they are difficult questions for man. Often they are confused in relativism, subjectivism, we might say. Perhaps they're confused because the majority no longer believe that there is an objective standard for the just. And what does it mean for the laws in that case? But certainly it is within the rights of man to topple the institution that supports false falsehood. Now, every time that happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that it must be completely overthrown and reestablished. But to this question, do you think you have the right to retaliate and to retaliation against your country and its laws? I know Socrates' answer. It's no. But the caveat here is a few lines down. I'll continue to read this. That if we undertake to destroy you and think it right to do so, you can undertake to destroy us so far as you can in return. And will you say that you are right to do so, you who truly care for virtue? Is your wisdom such as not to realize that your country is to be honored more than your mother, your father, and all your ancestors? That it is more to be revered and more sacred, and that it counts for more among the gods and sensible men, that you must worship it, yield to it, and placate its anger more than your fathers? You must either persuade it or obey its orders and endure in silence whatever it instructs you to endure, whether blows or bonds, and if it leads you into war to be wounded or killed, you must obey. Now the key statement is here: you must either persuade it or obey its blows or bonds. Now if this fig leaf, if you will, of persuasion was not buried within this argument, I would have a difficult time accepting that. But as long as man does have recourse, there's a possibility to give reason for his innocence, and there is a reasonable ear to hear it, and to save him from the arbitrary nature of state authority. Then I think that we have a sophisticated government, but at the same time, it seems as though the Athenians, which were much more government-centric, they were much more involved in the state apparatus than we are today. The state seems to make much loftier requirements of its citizens than it does today. Now, I would say that the state of today, perhaps it didn't always used to be this way, but the state of today seems to be more subversive to its citizens. But that's for another conversation. To do so is right, and one must not give way or retreat, or leave one's post. But both in war and in courts and everywhere else, one must obey the commands of one's city and country, or persuade it as to the nature of justice. And that's another key component. Either you must obey the commands or persuade it to as the nature of justice. So in Socrates' mind, if he was not able to persuade his peers of justice, then he will gladly accept his fate. And I can respect that viewpoint. Certainly a courageous one to make. Because, we can feel and we can believe all day that we are in the right. But in the first place, it is possible that a jury of our peers may not think so. In the second place, it forces us to take upon ourselves the burden of proving that we are innocent, and that regardless of the law of the state, it is up to us with our reason to say why we believe that we are right and the prosecutor is wrong, and in this way convince the state of the nature of justice. It is impious to bring violence to bear against your mother or father. It is much more so to use it against your country. What shall we say in reply, Crito? That the laws speak the truth or not? Crito says, I think they do. Now the question is, I think we have covered it before, but an important question to be answered is, what is the optimal relationship between the government or the state or the city and the individual? Now we could take the historical context and we can say that the relationship that Socrates has towards his country, towards his city, is this way because of the involvement of the state in his life, in his early life, in his upbringing. What does it mean for the state in this case to say that it's your duty to honor your state more so than your family, more so than your mother or your father? And why would it be the case that one should do so? Well, we've already discussed one potential reason. Because the city, or the state, is the very thing by which our liberties and our safety is secured. Now, this is something that can be used against us, no doubt. And perhaps it is being used against Socrates here in the way that the state, as it is arguing, is trying to convince Socrates that the subject of said state should be more devout and more committed to that state than to the family. Now, I have a difficult time accepting this as a truth because of the fundamental nature of the family, and that the strongest force that binds us together is a type of relationship to one another. It is a relationship of love. It's quite a large term with a deep meaning attached to it. Now, that it doesn't mean that the relationship between the individual and the state is nothing. It is quite important. But if we are to imagine a scenario in which the state is threatened by some outside force, we can make the argument that one should commit their lives to the defense of the state, even commit their lives to the defense of the state in opposition to the will of one's parents, let's say. But for the state to require that the individual to love it more than it loves its parents, I think is wrong. I think in our modern day, the relationship that we have to our state is certainly one of, well, I'll say it this way. Most of us, many of us, don't like to brush our teeth, but we must do so to prevent decay. And the decay that can befall our teeth can lead to some fairly severe consequences. And so we must, and we do, have an obligation to brushing our teeth. In the same way, we have an obligation and we maintain a relationship to our state. Now, our relationship to the state is a little bit more elevated than our relationship to our oral hygiene, but the analogy holds. Now, this antagonism that I experience within me, this antagonism that I think it has to do with the apprehension of the approaching totalitarianism, or rather I should say the approaching potential for totalitarianism or tyranny in general. And when I hear the state say things like and ask of the citizens certain responsibilities that outweigh the responsibilities that they have to their family, it is difficult to reconcile this. However, as the dialogue continues, the state, or the laws that are speaking, make some fairly reasonable claims. They say that there is nothing within us that says that you cannot leave if you see fit. If you desire to live elsewhere, we will not keep you here. And again, it is a matter of convincing the state of one's innocence, or do what they are told by the laws of that state. And now we've already established that to disobey the law is to upend the order that binds the society and the city together. The society and the city the society and the city that is together in the first place to maintain some sort of order and interaction among human beings that facilitates their flourishing. I would say that this is one of the potential goals of a society, because there has to be some reason why the hunter-gatherer would fix himself to a particular location. There has to be some intrinsic benefit. And I think this benefit can't just be the economical benefit. Of course, it is a binding force, no doubt, just as the state and the laws are a binding force. But man is a complicated animal. I think there are other forces at play here. We talk about culture. We've talked a lot about the gods, the Greek gods. Now this type of cultural force is a very strong binding force. I think it's at the level, and perhaps beyond, that of the natural law. Natural law in the sense of the governmental law, because the very thing that makes law possible is through the action of the divine. And we discover the action of the divine through human mind, through human insight. And through this insight, that again is facilitated by the abundance of food, let's say, and the access to other individuals who are at least relieved to some degree by the burdens of their base desires, of the necessities of life, of food and of hunger, that they can actually communicate with one another and articulate these thoughts and put together what they can conceive of. And so all of this is to say that the city or the state or the laws in general, I suppose, is a parent-like figure. Because just like the head of a household, they maintain the household. They maintain the bonds. Whereas the people that participate beneath the banner of the household, well, they participate in the relationships. They are one of the fundamental units of the household. The thing that is above them, that looks down upon them, and makes sure that there is safety and security is the parents. It is the head of the household. And in this way, the state and the laws of the state look down upon its inhabitants and ensure their security. But it's always a question of security, isn't it? We always have to sacrifice something to be more secure. And I don't think that there is a doubt in my mind that many potential harms can come from this desire for security. This liberation from the unfortunate reality that we find ourselves in. And I think this need and this desire for safety, at least on the human front, on the front of the individual, can often lead to this sort of inversion by the institution that exists at a level above the individual, that is sort of this collective moving machine, this spirit. And when the balance is off, this dynamic balance, the individual can be crushed under the weight of the very thing that he desires, which is safety and security. The man-made human institutions that lie above him, in the name of safety and security, can destroy or crush his soul. And I think this is what lies at the heart of my antagonism. Because it is not always the case that man's relationship to the state is a healthy one, and indeed a just one. It's contextual. Now, the case that the state is making here, I think, is fairly reasonable. It still really doesn't answer the question of whether or not the verdict was just. We can make a stronger argument if the state did not provide Socrates with the trial, and a trial in front of his peers, no less. The fact of the matter is, Socrates was convicted to imprisonment and death by a jury of his peers for corrupting the city youth and believing in his own gods. He tried his best to prove to the city and the laws of the nature of justice, and he failed. But I think what we can say here, if we assume that what Socrates is doing is right and maintaining his course and accepting his punishment, rather than fleeing and disobeying the law, we can say that it is not the fault of Socrates that he is going to be put to death. It is the fault of the state. The state is committing the sin. And so the moral argument is, well, if we are to disobey the law, then that is a sin, because if the law is meant to provide stability to the collective, to the state, to the city, and prevent its dissolution, and return people to a state of despotism, then it's right to follow its laws. And its rightness is backed up by its method of making the laws. The more representative they are, we can imagine the more just it is to follow them. But at a certain point, if one is to be a part of this state or collective, regardless of the justness of the law, we must reach a certain threshold of understanding that we have to obey this law if we are going to participate in this society. If we do not, then we cannot guarantee ourselves the privilege of living within that society. And so here I come to the reason of the laws, the reason of the state in this case. But I'd like to return to, again, the fundamental point that we had touched on, as the moral argument between the rightness and wrongness of the state and Socrates. So if the state has committed a moral wrong, rather than one of its citizens, then what? What is the recourse? Who punishes the state? Ultimately, we can say that the divine punishes the state. For if the state continually punishes those who are truly after the truth, then eventually the law will be against those that are after the truth. And if the law is against those that are after the truth, the society will eventually be made up of people that have very poor truth-finding ability. And if truth-finding is one way to find ourselves in closer harmony with our reality and with one another, then if this is absent, it's going to weaken the strongest bonds that humanity has to maintain a social collective, which is the bonds of love. And this scales up right into the bonds of law. Now, I'm not saying that law necessarily is love, but I am saying that without love there would be no law. And why would that be the case? Because part of the reason why we maintain a collective is because of the relationships that we have. Now, if we are going to have a collective that is based on things other than love, it is possible, but I'm not sure that a centralizing force would be possible. I'm not sure a state or a government would be possible. You can have different organizations that exist just sort of organically, that have their own ideas and conceptions of what is just, but that would be a state of anarchy. I suppose it's an interesting proposition, but it's not the one that we are entertaining here. We hear from the argument of the laws that Socrates has spent his life under the banner of the city. He has raised a family. He hasn't left except for military purposes. He has rejected exile for death, stating that death is preferable. And now, if it is indeed the case that he wishes to leave and disobey the law rather than to accept, when he had the chance, exile, which would be effectively what he is doing for himself, then this is an insult to the established order. Surely, they might say, you are breaking the commitments and agreements that you made with us without compulsion or deceit, and under no pressure of time for deliberation. You have had 70 years during which you could have gone away if you did not like us, and if you thought our agreements unjust. You did not choose to go to Sparta or to Crete, which you are always saying are well governed, nor to any other city, Greek or foreign. You have been away from Athens less than the lame or the blind or other handicapped people. It is clear that the city has been outstandingly more congenial to you than to other Athenians, and so have we. The laws for what city can please without laws. Will you then not now stick to our agreements? Will you, Socrates, if we can persuade you, and not make yourself a laughingstock by leaving the city? In a sense, the state is making the argument that Socrates has to do what he is fated. They give the argument that, if he leaves, if he goes to a neighboring state in which Socrates had said on occasion that they are well governed, these well governed places will not receive him well. They will see him as one that is a breaker of laws. Those that chose to convict him will, in a like manner, be vindicated. They will be proven right of their decision. For if one is to break the laws of the state, they are, sort of by extension, the type that would corrupt the city youth. If he chooses to go out into the wilderness and speak to the barbarians that exist there, he will have no conversation partner. He will not be able to live for virtue in that case. He will not be able to find truth as he can in Athens. Will life be worth living then? And what if he escapes to Thessaly, where Crito's friends and family are? What if he raises his children there? What can Socrates do in this case? He will have this moral burden on his back as he enters that state. The laws make the argument that your children can be brought up in Athens by your friends just as easily as they can be brought up in Thessaly. Except for in Thessaly they would be strangers. And I think an interesting appeal here is, be persuaded by us who have brought you up, Socrates. Do not value either your children or your life or anything else more than goodness, in order that when you arrive in Hades, you may have all this as your defense before the rulers there. If you do this deed, you will not think it better or more just or more pious here, nor will any one of your friends, nor will it be better for you when you arrive yonder. As it is, you depart. If you depart after being wronged not by us, the laws, but by men, but if you depart after shamefully returning wrong for wrong and mistreatment for mistreatment, after breaking your agreements and commitments with us, after mistreating those you should mistreat least, yourself, your friends, your country, and us, we shall be angry with you while you are still alive. And our brothers, the laws of the underworld, will not receive you kindly, knowing that you tried to destroy us as far as you could. Do not let Crito persuade you, rather than us, to do what he says. And the interesting last line by Socrates, let it be then, Crito, and let us act in this way, since this is the way the God is leading us. Again with the statement that the God, as in one God, not in many gods. So this concludes the Platonic dialogue Crito. I suppose I should offer an apology for the disjointed nature of it. It's not the best reflection. But we have to keep in mind that this is a piece of a whole, this narrative of Socrates being convicted. The next dialogue is Phaedo. This is quite a substantial philosophical work, in my opinion, and it's potentially life-changing. It certainly was for me the first time that I had read it. We will continue with that next time.